Transgender people are those that identify with a gender that does not match the gender assigned at birth. The Western world has for a long time had one standardized perception of gender. Yet throughout history, there have been people that defy these norms. A third gender has existed in many cultures, and in India, this subculture has formed a large community consisting of almost 500,000 people who call themselves Hijras. This community has been subjected to historical oppression due to conservative traditions. In stark contrast, there is Sweden, who is one of the most LGBTQ-tolerant countries on earth today, and therefore one may assume it has always been that way. Current legislative and social conditions differ heavily between the two countries, and while one has progressed further in transgender issues, significant reforms are still necessary in both countries to ensure social and legal equality for transgender people.
In 1972, Sweden became the first country in the world to allow people to change their legal gender. India, on the other hand, despite having a large traditional third gender population, the Hijras, only allowed people to change their legal gender without sex reassignment surgery after 2014. There's a larger pressure to allow people to do this in India, as a large portion of the trans population there lives in poverty compared to Sweden, as they are seldomly employed due to the social stigma, meaning that they can't afford the surgery. Oddly enough, the condition of surgery was reintroduced in 2019. Since 2005, India has, unlike Sweden, provided a third gender alternative on passports, something that Swedish LGBTQ+ groups are still working on today. Sweden does, however, have a widely used gender-fluid pronoun called hen. A strong similarity between the countries is that both have outlawed discrimination and hate speech against LGBTQ+ people. In Sweden, discrimination and later hate speech against trans people has been illegal since 2008 and 2018 respectively, while India outlawed discrimination of trans people in 2014. Despite all this, transgenderism is still considered a disorder today, although both countries have stopped calling it a mental disorder or disease. In Sweden, the label remains mainly as removing it would hinder trans people's ability to get medical and psychological aid.
The social conditions for trans people in India quite evidently stem from the colonial British beliefs which overruled the older Hindu acceptance of a third gender. Hindu acceptance could be seen in old literature which featured many third gender characters in religious settings. The religious affiliation has come to haunt the Indian transgender population as the ambivalent superstition that they can bless or curse people paired with colonial oppression has ostracized them in society. Due to this social exile, Hijras commonly have to beg for money or only have prostitution left as an option for means of employment. Transgender people in both countries are still subjected to social pressures, harassment, and discrete discrimination. It may be because of this that transgender people in both countries have significantly higher chance of attempted suicide. A study by Folkhälsomyndigheten concluded that more than a third of Swedish transgender people had seriously considered suicide in the last year. This, however, pales in comparison to India, where upwards to 31% end their lives in suicide, while upward of 50% have attempted suicide before the age of 20.
For an educated assumption on what the future will look like, one should first look at recent measures being taken to reduce existing issues and impediments for the trans community. This information can be used as a guide towards the probable future for trans rights in India and Sweden. Although measures in 2014 by the legal court were made to allow for self-determination of gender, this came with multiple contradictions. For example, that the certificate only labeled the person as transgender, but also that this self-determination had to be checked by a local government official. In the future, reforms need to be made to allow each the right to decide their gender expression, as well as the demand for Hijras to be considered female or a third sex. Current laws also need to be reformed, as they often hurt the ones they intend to protect. There is also considerable work needed regarding police reforms. Punishment for policemen guilty of abuse against Hijras needs to be implemented, and Hijras should not be placed in male cells to ensure their safety. Implementing a comprehensive sex education program as a part of the school curriculum, which provides information regarding sexuality, orientation, and identity, and also to educate the police force will be necessary to break down the social prejudice the general population may have. Overall, there is still a long way to go for India and its treatment of the trans community, but if legal efforts and public relations campaigns are continued, they are on track for improvement. Although contemporary Sweden is one of the most LGBTQ+ tolerant countries, it's not perfect. Despite laws being made to protect trans people, the social stigma still lingers and is one of the main threats for the future of the trans community. A study from 2016 concluded that 1/5 of the transgender people in the report answered with poor self-rated health, and 44% reported quality of life scores below the median. The causes seem to stem from the lack of legal gender recognition and negative healthcare experiences, as well as prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. The lower quality of life is also shown in the elevated suicide risk among trans people. To combat the social stigma, Sweden needs to continue with comprehensive sex education, including gender expression and identity. The heteronormativity of Swedish society must be combated through greater representation of trans people in the media, as these reach a broader part of the population. This would not only inform and expose people to the LGBTQ+ community, but would also control how this information is portrayed. Further improvement regarding legal measures is also being pursued. Recently, the government offices of Sweden have been working on legislation and on strengthening the equal rights of LGBTQ+ persons through commissions for government agencies. All in all, the future of trans rights and life in Sweden looks bright, with the exception of social stigma, which is something ingrained in society that would take time to exterminate. But considering all of the successes of recent years, there is no doubt things will only continue to improve.